Hi, welcome to
a
Literaturely.
podcast about teaching literature.
I'm Margaret Mock.
And I'm Paige Wallace.
And today we're talking about peer review, peer editing, workshop. Doesn't really matter what you call it. It's not typically considered a super sexy subject to talk about, but I think we're actually really excited to dive into it.
Yeah, is peer review not sexy? I'm out of touch.
I don't think it is for literature classes, because when I tried to research it, not a lot came up. And even looking on Twitter, most of the tweets being shared were from high school teachers.
So I guess then we want to talk about what our goals are for peer review and how they're different or the same as peer review goals for comp classes.
Yeah, so Paige, what is your goal? How does that change from moving from a composition class to a literature class?
So for composition classes, workshops, I think, are more technical. How do you organize your writing? How do you organize your ideas? And I think that peer workshops in a literature class, or peer review, not just workshop, in a literature class, gives students the opportunity to see analysis from their peers that are in the same position as they are. Right? So a lot of times we are giving them analytical essays that are, or critical essays that are way out of reach for them, for our students at this particular junction, right, in their academic career. Mm-hmm. And it can be overwhelming. And it's like, well, I understand what analysis looks like in that peer-reviewed article, but I can't do that. I'm not ready to do that. What does analysis look like for me? And I think peer review is a way to see what's working and what's not working. So much more easier than it is to see it in your own writing.
Yeah, no, I think to build off of that a little bit of seeing something in someone else's work makes it easier to see it in your own writing. I think that's one of the key benefits for me as well. That students can see what doesn't work in a literary analysis in someone else's work, and then they go back to their own and they're like, oh, I did the same exact thing. Right.
Yeah.
And I think they, at least for my classes, I hear them say that to one another, which I think is also really reassuring when you're getting feedback. To have someone in the same position with you. So I hear them say, okay, so you're doing this, but I'm also doing this. And then they start trying to work through, so how do we fix it if we're both doing this incorrectly? And I let them talk through that. I try not to swoop in, and I want them to... And we talk about it at the end as a class as a whole, but it's really great to see them feel comfortable with someone else. It's like that being vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Position. You have to be vulnerable in order to learn.
And I think that also speaks to how peer review helps students become more comfortable in sharing their work across the board. Because I think undergrad research is really important. And again, they also often feel like I'm not capable of doing that yet. I'm not ready to present at a conference, even on an undergrad panel, or I'm not ready to share my work with people because I'm just imposter syndrome. And I think peer review helps them get more comfortable with sharing their work and their ideas.
Yeah, so it sounds a little bit like we're both talking about peer review in the lit classroom, professionalizing them in some way, either for further literary adventures, or thinking long-term, how do you share your work? How do you give feedback? How do you receive feedback? How do you analyze something, assess a work? That there's somewhat of an assumption that our students at this level already have the writing foundation, that we're not as worried about skills or technicalities.
The technical aspects.
My words are all jarbling. Yeah, but that we're more focused on content,
right?
And the ideas, and can you clearly express this content? I know other things that I tend to want my students to focus on are things like balance of evidence and analysis, or consideration of having an actual argument, and then the priority that isn't as exciting. And I don't know that I also like to use peer reviews to make sure the students understand the assignment. And that I have built into the peer review where they answer questions, things like, does this fulfill the assignment? Why or why not? Restate the thesis, the author's thesis in your own words. So like they can't just be like, yeah, it's fine, yeah, it's good. Like it's a little bit of an accountability check beforehand too. Like, are you doing the work? Is this going to succeed? So there's no surprise twist at the end of our season together. I don't need that cliffhanger.
Right, ending. I'm 100% with you on that. I have like a policy, or not policy, but definitely work it into peer review. Like revisit the prompt, revisit the assignment sheet, and check for keywords, like stuff like that. So yeah, accountability does factor into how peer review works in the lit class.
I think it's nice to have that accountability. One, like again, like I was saying, I don't want to find out that my students didn't understand the assignment after it's too late. And you can like ask them throughout the semester, but if they think they understand it, they're going to say, "Yep, no problems." Like, and I also found that I just get a lot better work from my students when we're doing these check-ins throughout the semester rather than them cramming it in at the end, which is what I would do if I was a student and had no check-ins throughout. I'd be like, yeah, I can do that during finals week. That's when I'm going to write that paper. Which is like, it does a better job of fulfilling the course objectives if we're doing it throughout, because then I know that they're hitting those different marks rather than just hoping that they will.
No versus hoping. That's a really good point. I think also what you were saying earlier, just to kind of bring us back a little bit to the point you were making about whether or not they have an argument. When they're writing, that review or literary research essay or whatever it is, they think they have an argument. And so to them, there's an argument there. They know what's in their head. They know what they're trying to say. Whether or not they've gotten it down on paper or not is not always apparent. And so having that moment of peer review where they have to answer some questions or be accountable to their partner about the sort of strength of their argument is really productive, I think.
Yeah, I am one of those teachers that I give my students pretty detailed peer edit forms that they have to complete. And it does take a whole hour to complete these. And the reason I do that is because I have found that the majority of my students really haven't completed peer edits before. Or when they have, it's been read your partner's paper and tell them what you think. So they don't know what to do. That they're like, I know I'm supposed to assess this, but I don't know what to assess it for. I don't know how to do it. And so I also see peer edits as a way to start building that side. What we were talking about before, of like preparing our students to be able to assess and evaluate and explain how to improve. The peer edits for me are not for them to demonstrate how great they are already at doing it, but to build those skills to continue doing it. And I want to make sure that they hit certain things to look for. Like, these are the sorts of things to consider in a literary analysis, what the author's doing well. And we practice that throughout the semester, but I really want to make sure they're hitting it so that way each writer gets usable feedback.
Right, and so it's just another way of giving like this set of tools. And I think that by giving them, I also give like a really, I guess my students might describe it as tedious because they are used to workshops where they're in and out and they can say like, oh yeah, it's great, I love it. And I'm like, don't do that, I hate that. Here's this, like a checklist or a series of questions or whatever to go through this peer review process with. And I think that it's a way of reinforcing the tools that you already are going over with them. But again, maybe they've got a handle on, they could have a stronger grip, right? Or maybe they don't and they think they do. And so in that moment, peer review is a good way to assess that.
Yeah, so you just said that whole a lot of times they're used to just being like, yep, it's good, let's get out of here. It's sunny outside and I want to enjoy the day. I to try to like explain to them like the purpose of this, like so they don't rush through, I go over the difference between being nice and being kind. And being nice is reading your partner's paper and telling them it's so great, you did such a good job, even when there's a lot of problems. And that being kind is pointing out those problems so they can fix it before they turn in the paper. And I use the metaphor of like when you're out to dinner with your friend and they have food in their teeth. If you're nice, you don't say anything, you just ignore it, and then they find out later and are so embarrassed. And if you're kind, you say, "Ooh, you've got something right there." And unfortunately, this set me up that then after that, my students would say like, "Oh, Miss Mock, you have like a smudge on your face." It's like, "Oh, thank you for being kind."
I love that so much. Okay, so
I just remembered that. I had put it out of my brain until you were talking about that for some reason.
So the question is, do you still use that metaphor?
I do. I just make sure that I don't have smudges on my face anymore.
So like you basically you bought a compact mirror just to check before class, right? Okay.
Yeah. And I fixed the problem. So really they just demonstrated to me how it does work. Like once someone tells you that there's a problem, you adjust.
Okay. I love that. What about... Okay, so we've kind of gone over our goals, I feel like. We've covered those now. Do we want to talk about the different kinds of peer review that we've done in the past?
Yeah, so I think we've started to touch on it, that, like, the standard peer review of, like, providing the worksheet and all that. And I think maybe we can start there of talking, like, how that has typically worked for us. And then the alternative styles we've also used. So, yeah, how have you... I'm actually interested because I don't think we've ever shared peer review materials with one another, so I don't know what
I was just thinking that we should, if we're comfortable, share some of our peer review materials. Something that I can easily access and give to you. But, so, peer review... usually works. I think that maybe if you've been listening to us, you have already gotten the vibe that I like to do like a lot of like semester-long collaborative group work stuff. And so the way that I usually work out peer review is that I keep them in the same core groups. Every now and then I'll have groups cross over. But generally, I keep them in the same core groups, and they're reading each other's work over the course of the semester multiple times. So they have like an idea of who their partners are, their group mates are as writers, as academics, as students, right? And so I think they can give more, like, better feedback that way. But to mix it up, I try and do a different kind of peer review each time that group meets, right? So if we have 3 papers over the course of the semester and we peer review those once, then we have 3 different distinctly different peer review processes. And it really depends on at what stage we're in, right? So again, it's not a comp class, so I don't typically peer review the same essay multiple times, but I'll try and peer review like the proposal for the research essay, a draft for the literary analysis, or like a brainstorming peer review session for one of the smaller projects. And so if it's a brainstorming session, then that peer review might be like a pitch. So how can you pitch your ideas for this short literary analysis to your partners? And so then it's kind of like a covert draft assignment, right? So I'm not necessarily saying you have to draft your paper, but you have to be prepared to present a pitch on this scheduled peer review, and it needs to include, these 5 things, and it needs to be this length of time, or because sometimes I'll have them do them like with each other orally, but mostly I'll have them like write it out. So it also needs to be this number of words, whatever. So that's like one thing I'll do. If it's something like with the proposal, I've done like, what's your vision? Read your partner's proposal, answer this series of questions, and then give them like a end comment that lays out from reading the proposal what you think their vision is for the final product. And then if it's like a draft of a larger paper, I'll have them do the more traditional, like, let's exchange papers and then fill out this peer review form that covers, and I usually break my peer review forms up into different categories, right? So
I think that's really
yeah,
helpful.
so it'll start with like a category. I'm trying to think, like there's usually a category for analysis. There's usually a couple categories for analysis. So I'll do like, what's the thesis? And then a category with a series of questions. Like, do they have a thesis? How do you know? Does it pass the thesis statement checklist? And then a category for like analysis. What kind of evidence do they present to us? So on and so forth. And then some other categories are like flair, right? So I'll put like that, like, or sometimes I'll say like polish instead of flair, but I'm really talking about flair. Do I enjoy, like, as a reader, reading this essay? Am I excited about it? Can I hear that person's voice? Stuff like that. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what I do with that traditional peer review. I'll talk about my less traditional option, or, you know, out of the box after you tell me about yours.
I think in some ways our traditional are pretty similar approaches. I normally break it up into multiple rounds in my literature classes as well. So we workshop first the proposal. I have the students break up typically in groups of 4, where they're responsible first for working in partners and then swapping, like talking as a group, so they get a few different perspectives in that. Then students, after they receive that proposal feedback, they outline, and then we conference at that point, and then we do another peer edit for a draft. But for the proposal, they turn it into me, and I'm actually sitting in the front of the class. They have to bring a hard copy that day, and I try to give feedback while they're workshopping. So I'm workshopping kind of along with them, and I never work so fast as I do during those. So the proposal feedback is not super extensive from me that day. I am sort of relying on the students, but it's for me to catch any sort of huge errors or red flags or misunderstandings. But for the most part, I just give like a couple sentences so that way I can get through, you know, all 32 of them in the 50 minutes we have.
That's impressive.
And again, I have never worked so fast as I do it that day. It's not necessarily hard work, because proposals are kind of fun to read, where you're like, oh, okay. But it is a hustle. But I also think it helps model for them that this is something we're taking seriously. And so they kind of work steadily throughout that day too. And so while I'm doing that, they are looking at each other's work, and for the peer editor, they first have to assess whether or not the proposal meets the criteria of the project and explain why. But they also have to consider, like, does this sort of project seem like it only requires 4 to 6 pages, or whatever the length is that day or for that project. Typically, the term papers I have are like 6 to 8 pages, but you know, they always have more to say than they think they do. So I'm like, does it seem like they could answer this in 4 pages?
Right.
Sometimes they're like, oh, this would take a book. Like, if it's just like, since the beginning of time. Then I have like some language that's specific to my proposals, where I tell my students that proposals identify a specific problem, whether it's a problem like in the conversation about the text, or like problem in the text. So like my proposal feedback, like, or form talks about like, what problem is the proposal talking about? What are 3 things you associate with this problem? Why do you think this problem, what do you think the most important part of this problem is? Does the novel actually have a connection to this problem? Where I'm really trying to get them to work, like, give the writer some other things to consider that they may have overlooked. They also like have to answer things like, can you think of any similar arguments to this? Or can you think of any useful materials the author should look into? What sort of evidence do you think the writer should try to incorporate or look for when they start researching? What are the key terms you associate with all of this? And it's really just coming up with the plan. And then they give encouragement. So it's like, what is most exciting about this? And then after that, the writer has to answer questions themselves about the proposal. So they have to answer things like, what initially drew you to this topic and why are you still interested in it? Why do you think this is important? What are your next steps? And like, give me the specific steps. What do you think the strongest counter argument is? And like, what questions do you have? And they upload that to their site so I can check that out before their conference with me. So that way I know why they care about it. So if it's a project that doesn't work and it's something like, I'm interested in this because I'm an education major, then maybe like I can be like, oh, well, these are issues for education majors or people in this field that we can think through. Or if they're like, I care about this because I'm really interested in race right now, then like, okay, well, let's think about how we can make this topic more specific. Here are some like resources you might be interested in, and go from there. The second draft of the workshop is pretty similar to page as well, where it's like broken in those categories. And I focus like on thesis, intro, what types of evidence they're using, the analysis. And then I also break down organization into two parts because I want my students to really think about how everything fits together. So we talk about like the organization of individual paragraphs and then how they fit as a whole. And then style, like what you talked about. And I also try to do an overview because I know I can't hit everything. So in the overview, I have like, what is your general impression of the paper? What are two things the author needs to work on? What are two things they do well? And I always try to end it on the positive, like like end with something they're doing great. Tell them there's hope. Right. But I used to have them answer what are 2 to 3 adjectives you would use to describe this paper. So they knew that general impression, but it's too abstract of a question, I found. So they'll just always say things like interesting, unique, which isn't very helpful. Right. So that's what I do. And I tend, like I said, have them work in groups of 2 and 3 for the draft because there's really only time for them to get through one of these. I was trying to figure out like how many questions I have for each, but it's like a 2 pages of just questions. Oh, it's actually 3 pages.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a fair bit, but I want them to really think about like everything an argument has to have to succeed, and break that down. And I also expect them to answer in complete answers. That I say you can't do yes or no because that doesn't actually let the author know why they're succeeding or failing. Right. Like you even if it's just copying and pasting from their paper and saying like here, this doesn't work. At least that's a place for them to start and be like, oh, so why is this
okay, so I have some questions. So do you workshop or have them do a peer review session for the same paper multiple times?
They do the workshop for the proposal and then the draft, and I individually conference with them.
Okay. And is that for your term paper?
Yeah, that's for our term paper. I will have extra credit where they can review another draft again. Okay. And I do tell them that if they sign up for that, they have to see it through because it's extra credit that requires a partner, and so it's not fair to leave someone hanging.
And so do you workshop or do peer review sessions for more minor papers?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that my critical conversations that we've talked about are basically peer review practice where it's not as straightforward. It's a little bit more abstract, so they get used to assessing an argument. So that's the one where they do flash essays throughout the semester. Yeah, and they respond using agree and, agree but, agree yet, disagree because. And that's actually built into these workshops, those ideas of agree and whatnot. And so those responses that you do throughout definitely work up to these sorts of like, what sort of analysis is the writer doing? What are the other scenes that would be helpful to support this argument? Why would you disagree with them? But they only get those 2 for the term paper themselves, or at least that I require. Okay. They can always sign them.
Wait. I'm not done yet. I have one more question. Oh. So do you ever do like peer reviews, like online peer reviews that don't happen during class time?
Yes. So for the critical conversations, like those, they had the option to do in the classroom or at home. And the majority, I'd say like always minimum 75% wanted to be in class. But the ones who elected to be at home the entire semester with them, which is fine. I found in general, if they have the option, they want to be in class because they like to be able to ask questions immediately, just like we're doing right now, like having that conversation side to it, versus just submitting the form and washing their hands of it. I think they realized that they don't necessarily read the feedback if it's not immediate, unfortunately. So that's the bonus. Peer Edit is also online, and in that they're, because it's not taking place in class, so they just have to do it at home. I don't know how to make it more immediate in general, so that like students, because I found that in my comm class teaching online, like students weren't always remembering that they were also receiving feedback, not just giving it. Yeah, have you done online peer edits? Have you been able to figure out how to?
Well, I think one thing that helps with that is to always have that reflective part, like that reflection, where students are, after they've received feedback, they have to fill out a sort of like reflection on the feedback that they received. I think that can make them like more engaged, right, with interrogating the feedback they get versus just like giving feedback. But I do think you're right that face to face is nice, and
I think it makes them more receptive to the feedback too, because
absolutely
there's a person, right? Like it feels more familiar and like that they care about you rather than just someone criticizing you, which is never the case, but sometimes
it can feel that way.
It's easier to get defensive with the screen.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And so that's maybe something that we could crowdsource a little for thinking about. Like I'm teaching online this summer and we're all, again, dealing with that possibility. What are some ways that peer review could work in more that, like, that organic, fluid way of conversation, right? Because we do have them fill out those sort of formal, like, handouts, giving feedback, but there is so much that happens in those moments of being able to ask questions and talk back and forth, that you just don't get with that, with just them answering those questions.
And even just the accountability of having to show up into the room with your draft. I know teaching like online, I had a lot of students who would just disappear. But they would disappear suddenly, you know, they would have been doing the work the whole time and suddenly they're just gone. And so I don't realize until I have a student emailing me that so-and-so didn't submit a draft for me to review. So the logistics get more complicated. But yeah, my brain's sort of rushing now, thinking like of ways we could work through that. I'm kind of excited to hear what people have to say. Yeah. Because I do think that's something that seems more and more likely for the fall that we'll have to address.
Right, yeah. And you want to recreate, because peer review can be so productive, so generative, and so like being able to recreate those face-to-face interactions as much as possible.
I'm also realizing this is going to be up in September, so people will know whether or not they are teaching online or not. So let us know.
This is true.
How's it going?
Yeah. Okay. Then I guess we maybe talk about the different, well, I guess, what questions do you have, Margaret?
Well, I can't think. They disappeared out of my brain, which is one of the pitfalls like of peer editing face-to-face, is that it's really easy to go down
the rabbit hole.
One road. Yeah. And I love a rabbit hole. There's rarely a rabbit hole I see that I'm not jumping down. But I think you kind of like, so I was thinking at the end when you were talking about moving online and like kind of the reflection activity, which I think is really interesting. It's sort of that, okay, these are maybe problems maybe with just using like a form approach to peer review. So what are some of the other ways you handle your peer reviews that are like less typical?
Yes. Well, now that you're saying the you've mentioned this, like what ways other than the form. So I mentioned pitches, but I still think they fall under that more typical way of doing it. I have adapted something that I was just thinking about. I've only done it once, I think, for a lit class. It was adapted from a comp class where we do like speed workshop. So the entire thing, so everything's broken up into rounds. It has to be a really short draft, right? So like the first page of your literary analysis, it can't be something like the research paper because that's just too, I mean, I guess it could, but I feel like it's just too big. But you break them up into categories, like break them up. Let me start over. You break the activity up into a series of rounds, usually 4 or 5, depending on how long your class is. So it works better in a class that's like a Tuesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, because it's a longer class. And I'm like, is that 90 minutes or 65? I don't know. However long. Yeah. But basically, then you figure out how long each category they have in it. So if you're in a 50-minute class, then you really only give them like 5 to 7 minutes for each of those categories, so that you'll have time before and after to kind of like regroup. And so then it's entirely back and forth. So you set the desk up where they're one person on each side, right? The desks facing each other in a straight line. And so after each round, they have during each round, they have a set of things they have to talk about. So you give them like a minute to read and then 4 minutes to talk. And so for round 1, they talk about intros or thesis statements or whatever. And then they switch. So they one row moves and then the other stays. So it's just like speed dating, quote, quote, but with your drafts. So that's something that I've done. It's a little hectic and it's more, again, it has to be done at the beginning because it's more about generative stuff, I think, than revising. But they like it. They have fun with it. And I think it's productive because, again, they're seeing like 5 other examples of works in progress at the very beginning. And so that's something I have done and would want to do more, I think.
Yeah, no, I haven't done anything like that, but I agree with you that I like I'll sometimes have them in groups where it's like you're going to do merry-go-round. So like I break them up maybe into like groups of 5 and they pass their papers around, but each pass leads to a different set of questions. Mm-hmm. But it's also like what you were saying, so they can see multiple examples, so they can see whether or not they're lining up, but also they get multiple takes on their paper, because sometimes you just get someone who like doesn't get your work, but it doesn't mean it's bad, or vice versa.
Right.
So I do like those sorts of approaches where it's maybe not less in depth, but more overview. I think that's really useful to do early on, when they're still getting their bearings.
Yeah.
And I think I've also adapted some other things from comp classes to lit classes. I'm now remembering for things like I think it was like my intro to short story class. Because they're not just majors in that course. It's a humanities requirement. That they cut up their papers into individual paragraphs and had to shuffle them, and their partner had to try to put it back together to see if their train of thought made sense. And if all the paragraphs actually fit into it, because every once in a while you get that rogue paragraph and it's like, what does this have to do with the rest of it?
Right.
And so that's sort of fun, and they have to talk throughout it. I don't give any real question. I think I maybe give like 3 questions that they have to answer at the end. But in general, they have to talk to their partner when about certain conclusions their peer editor made, or their peer editor has to check in with them if they hit a wall. So that's sort of fun and lets them work through some issues without feeling silly or pressured.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so another thing I do is more for like the end of the drafting process. So I have had students present their papers in a sort of like conference style, so like a draft of it. So again, like it's for a term paper, and the draft is like something they can read in like 8 minutes ish, so like 5 pages essentially. And so the time that's been most successful for me is that I had them do their proposals, and then we grouped everybody based on their proposals and their topics, and then they presented on like their paper, their conference quote paper on that specific day with the rest of their panel. And so then that also helped because I want them to ask questions at the end. But after one student goes, they're like, I don't know if I have any questions. But when 4 students go at the end of that, then they will ask questions.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, and so that has been a really fun like peer review. And then it also gives me a chance. So like if I do that, if the term papers due at the end of the semester, I'll try and do that 2 weeks before the end of the semester, and then, or even 3 weeks, and then have an optional conference period. And so that after I've heard their paper, their conference presentation per se, I can then meet with them in an individual conference and talk about what I like, some issues that I heard just while listening to their paper, and then they have that opportunity to fix it before they turn in the final.
So when you schedule that sort of peer edit workshop, how many classes does it take? Can you get them, does it take 2 or?
Well, the depends on the class, obviously. So I'm thinking when I did this for my perspectives on short story class, there were 29 people in that class. We broke it up so that maybe we weren't just doing presentations the whole entire time. So I think I ended up doing across 4 classes. So we're like, the first half of class would be like lecture or discussion, and then the second half of class would be like 2 panels. And the questions that go with that.
Okay, that makes sense. You're also making me realize, talking about that the presentations I have my students do also, I think, prepare them for peer edits, where their presentations are frequently on the secondary reading. And so the questions they have to answer for that are things like provide the context of the work, assess the person's argument, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and all of that. And I'm like, oh, they sort of peer edit, Henry Louis Gates and Judith Butler. So I think in some ways literary classrooms were building in those peer edits throughout the semester, those skills, and the peer edits the time to see it pay off in a more direct way.
Absolutely.
But I like the idea of doing a conference style peer edit, because I think that also shows them the stakes of this sort of work.
Yeah, and I'm pulling straight from my undergrad experience. I had a contemporary literature class that had us grouped us, put us on panels, and then, or the professor grouped us, put us on panels, and then we presented for a series in a very conference style.
That's so funny you say that, because I don't think I did any peer edits after my freshman year. That we had to do peer edits in our freshman reading and writing classes, which that's what they were. We had 1 semester on reading and 1 semester on writing. And then never again. And it was really individual, shotgun from then on.
I guess you guys just had it, right?
Yeah, just nailed it. I think the most collaboration we really did was in my theory class. We had to do a collaborative essay. but I can't think of any other time where I worked with other students in my undergrad English classes, which it now hits me as so strange, but at the time just felt, yeah, this is how English
Yeah.
classes work. It's just you're writing a paper, so it's just all on you.
Maybe we should, in the future, investigate collaborative essays. Like, because I say that because they make, the idea of them, it makes me very uncomfortable.
I didn't love
Yeah,
it.
like,
but
we don't want to go too much in the rabbit hole, not to cut you off, but I know you like to jump in. But I think that's something we should maybe think about later.
I'd be down to talk about it and think about how to make it work. Because I do have them do group projects, and yeah. Anyways,
Yeah.
I guess if we're thinking about this, maybe we can pivot to thinking about how do we grade peer edits, because that's where my brain goes to with group projects of that grading, but we're not talking about group projects. So I guess like maybe we should start with just the general question of how do you want peer reviews to impact the grading? Like, do you think it's something that should receive a grade? Is it no stakes? How do you?
I think it has to have stakes, because inevitably, if it doesn't, then you want to create a classroom community where the students, the stake is that you're going to let your partner down. But inevitably, you have students that, for whatever reason, are not motivated by that. So it's usually something that I grade in terms of like completion. Because I'm a little uncomfortable with like assessing like how well they've done a peer review. Because again, like, especially when you first start peer reviewing each other's papers, they sometimes just don't have the language or the tools to do it, and they're trying really hard, but they don't know what to say or how to do it. Now, with that being said, I always get a copy, right? So they always have to give it to me first, and then I give it back, or they have to upload it somewhere, or some such thing as that, because I do read through them, and I make note of people, students that aren't taking the workshop session seriously. And so in those cases, it's less about, like, I'll still grade them for completion, but I'll usually just have a chat with them. Like, hey, I've noticed that, your workshops aren't really up to par. Like, your workshop feedback isn't up to par. Let's talk about how we get it where it needs to be. And it's either a case of, like, they just don't have the tools yet and they're working on it, or they didn't think we were taking it that seriously, and now they know we are. And it'll usually, if that's the case, they'll snap them out of it. If it doesn't snap them out of it, then I just start taking off the grade. Like, hey, you didn't write in complete sentences, right? Like, really picky. And I'm not usually like that. But if they're not taking workshops seriously, then they are letting down their classmate, and I will pull their grade for that.
And that's like, I think, the biggest stakes for me with peer edits is that I don't want any of my students to not receive the feedback they need, because for many of them this sort of work is essential for their growth in the classroom, and they need to receive that feedback from multiple sources, not just from me. And so if another student's not going to put in the time and effort, it does affect the education of their peers. And so I agree with you. Like, I like to have some stakes involved just so there's that added incentive to not let their fellow students down. I also think it's nice to have that padding in there. So students who are showing up consistently, are trying as hard as they can, if they are maybe coming into the class with not the strongest foundation, but they're really working hard to build that, it's not that they're going to be, they can still work for a good grade in the course, or that they can take a risk. That we talked in the past about having like term paper options, term project options, where they can maybe go a little bit riskier, write a business proposal for Feminist Bookstore, or do a podcast or whatever. And I feel like the workshops alleviate that risk, so they can really push themselves and challenge themselves without worrying about tanking their entire semester.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have that built into my syllabus, so they see like proposal is worth 3%,
Right.
and half of that 3% is doing the proposal itself, but the other half is doing the
Right.
workshop. And same with like 5 points for conferences or whatever. So,
And so, Margaret, we've talked about, like, I guess, like, peer review and how it impacts like student grades, but then how does peer review impact like the kind of feedback that you give, or does it? You did mention that, like, with those that proposal workshop, you give really quick feedback because you want to get it to them during that session. But is there, like, do you have any other thoughts on this?
So since I have typically a conference in between where I meet with them individually, I normally start that conference by asking them what sort of feedback they received, and how they felt about it, and if they have any, if it, initiated any questions or anything like that, and we build off of that. But overall, it doesn't directly affect the feedback I'm going to give them too much, because I see it as supplementary voices where I have my perspective and my understanding of their work, and so my feedback is going to reflect that. But I'm not the only reader, so their peers are going to read their work a different way, have different thoughts, and if they're consistent, they're consistent. If there's a contradiction in what their peer is saying and what I'm saying, we talk about that and why that might be the case and which way they can go with it. And so, yeah, the answer, I guess, is not really. It doesn't affect it. It's just another step. But how about
I
you?
really like that description of, like, the supplementary readers. I think that that's really useful. Sometimes I will use, like, the same guide as the one that they got during their peer review to kind of guide me in leaving their marginal comments. Right? Mm-hmm. So, making sure that those categories are also reflected in the marginal comments that they give to me, and using some of the same language so that they can see like it manifests from me as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's maybe the most direct connection I have, is that the peer review categories correlate pretty closely to the rubric categories that I use, which is more for them to see, like, what they're going to be assessed on, what are the important parts of the paper, but also a reminder of those stakes of, like, take this seriously. But yeah, it's always a little bit funny grading peer edits, because it does feel like a check mark. It's not really a lot of analysis happening that I think, like, in some ways, grading peer edits is very satisfying, as tedious as it is, because it is just that check mark. You can turn it out pretty quickly versus grading the actual papers.
Yeah, it's the thing you do to procrastinate grading the actual papers.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. But I don't know, any final thoughts on peer edits?
No, I don't think so. I think that this was super productive. I felt like I had more to say about peer edits than I thought I did.
Yeah, I also now have a lot of things I want to try with peer edits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks to you, yeah. So when you use peer edits in your next dream class, what is that dream class going to be?
So I don't know if it's just 2020, but I want to talk about monsters all the time. So I was thinking about, like, a class on, like, Frankenstein, starting with, like, Mary Shelley, obviously, having them read Frankenstein, but then moving into things like Galatea 2.2, which Richard Powers, I don't know if we've brought him up before. I would be surprised if we haven't. But
I think we may have talked about him. I'm not sure.
So, like, and maybe our conversation before we started recording about, like, the academy a little bit, or higher ed, I think Galatea 2.2 would also make me think about, like, what's human? How do we dehumanize people, like, in terms of labor? How's that relevant to higher ed? Stuff like that. Obviously, motherhood is important, I think, to talk about with Galatea 2.2 in a roundabout way, or not. And maybe I'm just feeling particularly salty about Florida State right now, so maybe I would talk about that. So again, like, I guess, like, they won't be as relevant, but they're policy about working parents during COVID. Anyway, bypassing the rabbit hole. But that I would also maybe bring in Frankenstein.
Oh, did you start that?
Start it.
I haven't started.
So, and there's so many adaptations of Frankenstein. I would also want to bring in some film adaptations, but I don't know what. But essentially, I've realized that every time I talk about my dream course, I do the thing that I said I'm not going to do, and I'm like, here are the text I would use. But I think my objectives would be to look at, this image of the monster, and how it's changed, and the way in which we use the language of the monstrous to dehumanize people, or to validate our poor ethics.
I'm trying to remember who the article is written by. It's called The Other Woman, and I forget what happens comes after the colon, but it's about how feminism, we always talk about I know this woman who in a lot of these speeches and rhetoric, and my sister, and how that creates a problem of creating feminism in a self-likeness while also othering. These experiences don't happen to someone who's put together and is going to be the voice of the movement. It happens to those other women that are behind the scenes. And I think we're seeing a change in that right now. This article, I think, was written in the 80s. But that could be useful, too, for thinking about that sort of benign otherization that's not so benign.
Yeah. Yeah, and I keep seeing that image of, that sewn together flesh every time I think about this class. And so I think that would be a recurring image in the class. And
yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. So, Margaret, what's your dream course?
Well, I'm going to take a note from you and talk a little bit about the course objectives for this, but I think I'd want a class on novels with footnotes. And we talked a little bit about this before. The reason I want to do this is because I want students to think about research in the humanities in general, but more specifically in literature courses, and think about the narratives that happen when we research, that we're taking data and putting it together to form a narrative, and what are the ethics of that? Whose voices do we include? Who do we exclude? So I think we'd look at Sadia Hartman's Venus in Two Acts to initiate that conversation, but then start working with footnotes and so some texts that I think would be useful, like The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, The Mezzanine, House of Leaves, but also Joyce Carol Oates has a really weird novel called My Sister, My Love, where and so thinking about what are these protagonists researching, what drives it, are these ethical searches, and what is an ethical research practice and all of that. So it'd be sort of content wise a class on the structure of a novel, but the actual objectives would be thinking about research and research methods.
I think that would...
I don't know what sort of final project what that would look like.
Ooh.
But that would
have to be something with footnotes.
Yeah, I think it would be a pretty meta project.
Yeah. Have them write some sort of narrative with footnotes.
Yeah, and they'd have to talk about their research process.
That would be really interesting.
The footnotes maybe would be the research process. How did you find this information?
Right. Oh, I love that final project.
That's all I can think about lately, to be honest, is just this how to talk about research and the ethics of it more. But someday.
Yeah. All right.
All of these dream courses are somedays.
Absolutely. Okay, Margaret. We'll talk to you later.